at the Bar Ilan University. And he teaches in the Department of Political Studies at the same university at Bar Ilan. He is the executive director of NGO Non-Governmental Organizations Monitor, specializes in international relations, strategy, arms control, diplomacy, and soft power. A very welcome thing, soft power, particularly in the Middle East. The topic of his lecture is the politics of human rights in the Arab-Israeli conflict. Professor Steinberg, b'kasha.
Thank you, Ambassador Mayer. Thank you to the organizers of this conference and to the Tanya Academic College for the opportunity. The issues are extremely important. They are complex. They are very much in the news yesterday and today, unfortunately not in the kind of ways that we don't want them in the news at all, but certainly not in the way that it's been, and I'll talk about that a little bit. Can I have the PowerPoint on, please, whoever's does PowerPoints here? Maybe I have to just plug this in. Is that? Good. Okay. I have 15 minutes to discuss the complexity of this issue. Largely, I'm going to try from an academic point of view. Look at this as a TED Talk, 15 minutes. You got to get it out there. It's a long elevator ride or a short airplane ride. If you want to go through all the details, either ask questions afterwards, read one of the books that I've got here, or take the course that I teach on these issues. And particularly, the emphasis is on looking for an academic background. These issues that we're going to talk about, soft power is not something unique to Israel. It's something that's much broader than that, something that all, certainly Western democratic societies have to deal with. Public diplomacy, an area that Israel is particularly not good at from what we've seen and continue to see, is going to be something that we're going to have to continue to deal with. And what I'm going to try to do in the next 15 minutes is lay out some of these issues as the background, as the focus, as the context for what's often called delegitimization, but is far more complex, and I'd be careful about using that term because it really does not provide the depth and the context that we need. What we're really talking about, I would claim, or at least the main element, the basis, is the abuse, the exploitation, the politics of human rights in the Arab-Israeli conflict. That is a different front. It's third-generation warfare that we have to deal with. And if I can get the... Okay, we have to look at it from the beginnings. Certainly one can go back many years, but I'll start it with 2001. And again, everything is going to be very short and to the point. The Durban Conference, the NGO form of the United Nations Durban Conference, what Natan Sharansky talked about, the United Nations Human Rights, in those days it was the Commission, organized this massive conference. 1,500 organizations participated. There were over 5,000 delegates in a big stadium in Durban, South Africa, to celebrate the end of apartheid. And what they did there, it was carefully organized, carefully planned. This was a political assault. This was a declaration of political war. As I said, third generation warfare. This was an attempt to define Israel as an apartheid state, to inherit the mechanisms and the definition and the framework and the condemnations and the isolation that had gone to South African apartheid. And anybody who doesn't understand that background will never understand the seriousness of this assault. It is not about Israeli policies. It is not a disagreement on occupied territories or on settlements or Palestinian refugee claims or all of the other issues and dimensions. It is about, as this language that was adopted by these 1,500 organizations declared very clearly, to define Israel as an racist apartheid state. These are just 3 short paragraphs of a much longer section, and look how many times this language appears here. This was adopted by Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International and all the other organizations that were there in the United Nations framework. And that continues to be the context in which we have to look at all these issues. This is where the Goldstone Report came from. This is where the flotilla came from. This is where the fly-in came from. This is where the ISM activists come from under this framework. And what I argue is that leading this process are a group, these are the 1,500 organizations, round numbers, non-governmental organizations. Now, I don't have time now to talk about how that term is misleading. That's lecture number 4 in the series, and I won't do it now. But these, what are supposed to be non-governmental organizations, many of which are funded largely by foreign governments, and unfortunately we've now found in the last 3 or 4 years also the U.S. government has become involved. They are the organizations that promote this agenda that we just saw, the apartheid, the Israel war crimes, war criminals, lawfare, BDS, boycotts, divestments, and sanctions agenda. We saw it 10 years ago. It is now 10 years since the myth of the Janine massacre. We're in Netanya. I don't have to tell you the background to the Park Hotel massacre, the number of Israelis who were killed in daily war crimes from the Palestinian terrorists. When Israel went in to try to defend its citizens, we had this Janine massacre myth. The first non-Palestinian, quote, confirmation of this entirely invented story came from Amnesty International. It was propelled by these non-governmental organizations in the Durban process. From there it became headlines in the media, picked up in the United Nations, commissions were organized, investigations or pseudo-investigations, then it's being quoted by my academic colleagues in learned journals and publications. That is the background. Again, it's very much detailed in the book that we recently published called The Goldstone Report, Reconsidered, a Critical Analysis. You can get it on Amazon. And it is the basis for this entire process. That's where the Goldstone process came from. It is also where the flotilla process and incident came from, in which even before, this was 2 years ago, even before the Israeli military landed on the ships with paintball guns initially, the 30 NGOs that were involved had originally already prepared condemnations. They just pushed a button and it was out there all over the place. Immediately afterwards, the entire media process came into effect and we saw it all. And every organization that is involved in this process, multi-million-dollar organizations, put their entire PR weight behind calls for immediate investigations, inquiries, as Natan Sharansky said. Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, in other words, using language like collective punishment, like piracy, violation of international law, accusing Israel of getting away with murder. This was before any facts were even known. The illustrations, the graphics that goes with this campaign are particularly damning and very clear in their message. I brought you two. There are many more like this, two that are particularly incendiary. The one that you see on your left, which is the classic anti-Semitic images, won a prize by an organization called Badil, which is a very large multi-million-dollar, euro, pound, right of return refugee care organization funded by a number of European governments. And I have to say, with all due respect to the organizer of this conference, the American ambassador is expected to speak. There are a number of people. There is no European representative here. The European governments that paid for this kind of blatant anti-Semitic propaganda, where you see the merger between the old and the new anti-Semitism. Look at that cartoon, which is funded by the 4 European governments and the NGO Development Center, Dan Church Aid, Norwegian People's Aid. And the other image that was produced and distributed in Arabic and in English, which accuses Israel through a false image of sexual harassment, funded by European governments, the EU directly, the New Israel Fund, George Soros's OSI organization. This is all part of the incitement process. It gets carried on in multiple dimensions. We're talking about a framework where there is at least $100 million a year involved. And that's an important part of the process. This doesn't come from a group of organizers. It doesn't come from a group of people who are dedicated to the Palestinian cause and leave their jobs and their student work and go to fly into Tel Aviv airport in order to demonstrate on behalf of the Palestinians. There is a lot of money. There's a huge amount of money behind this process. And we don't know how much is money because a large part of it is not transparent. Many of the European government organizations, and particularly the European Union, do not practice transparency, do not practice due process. You cannot get any documentation on how this decision is made to give money to the Israel Committee Against House Demolitions, which organizes free Gaza flotilla events, and to dozens and dozens of other organizations. We track 150 at NGO Monitor, almost all of which get funding from European governments. That's the massive amount of money that comes into this. There's other funding as well, from foundations, from the Ford Foundation, from other foundations, from George Soros. But the bulk of it comes from European governments in secret giving large funding to Israeli, Palestinian, European non-governmental organizations. As I often ask European diplomats in my non-diplomatic role, I say, what about non-governmental organizations you don't understand by giving so much government money to them in a form of outsourcing of their diplomatic and public policy approaches? This is how they want to change Israeli policy. This is how they want to develop the peace process in their image, by funding fringe organizations that promote many of these agendas. Lawfare, just one illustration of this, and again, this is a very short and compressed presentation. This is an image, I think it came from Al Jazeera, taking a conference that took place in Cairo. In November 2008, this was about a month and a half before the Gaza operation. And look at who's paying for this conference on the impunity and prosecution of Israeli war criminals. It's the European Union and an organization called Oxfam Novib, which is funded by government money out of Holland. They are the ones who organized this event. How do we deal with this? And I'll do this briefly, but of course that has to be the key here. It's not just enough to diagnose the disease. At NGO Monitor, my colleagues and I, and we work closely with other organizations as well, we've identified 4 important dimensions to this process. Each one deserves a lecture in itself and a lot more, but I'll try to do this very briefly. Okay, a little competition here, I see. The first is to restore the morality, the universal morality of human rights. That means that this is not about Israel only. It's about how the entire human rights mechanism has been distorted to become a political weapon. When human rights violations are ignored around the world, and only Israel is the focus, this famous or infamous Article 7, the permanent agenda of the Human Rights Council, that means that real victims of human rights, women throughout the Arab and Muslim world, victims of so-called honor killings and in so many other dimensions, don't even get a chance to have their cases presented. The way the international legal system has been abused in order to promote political warfare against Israel. So restoring the universality and the moral foundations of human rights is essential. There's been some success in this process, maybe a technical success. The International Criminal Court, which was the object of the Goldstone Report and so many other activities, so many submissions, largely led by non-governmental organizations like Amnesty, Al-Haq, Palestinian Center for Human Rights, the French International Center for Human Rights, and Adala, all submitted briefs and led publicity campaigns to press the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court to open up a case which would have violated all of its foundational documents against Israel brought by the Palestinian Authority, which is not even a state. The ICC rejected it not on substantive grounds as it should have, because there is no case here, but on technical grounds that Palestine is not a state. It was the right decision, perhaps for the wrong reasons, but it shows that there are limits to how far these campaigns can go. And it was very important. There was a very successful educational process, which many of us participated in order to impress upon the prosecutor and the members of the International Criminal Court and the states behind it that this would have been a very, very damaging blow to the credibility of the ICC. The third element is naming and shaming. When moral abuses take place, when human rights is blatantly abused in order to attack Israel through double standards, through the 3Ds that Nachan Sharansky has talked about, there are intelligent people, there are moral people within this human rights framework who realize that the time has come to stand up and be counted. Robert Bernstein, the founder of Human Rights Watch, which has done so much damage to human rights by promoting anti-Israel ideology, by failing to have any expertise or professional capabilities in their reports. Robert Bernstein in 2009 recognized this and wrote an op-ed piece in the New York Times denouncing the organization that he founded for having led the campaign or helping turn Israel into a pariah state through its claims and false reports. That was a major step. When Judge Goldstone reversed himself and said that the primary claim or allegation in the entire pseudo-investigation that has his name in the report that they issued, which claimed that Israel deliberately and intentionally killed civilians in Gaza, had no evidence for that claim, that was a major change. It took a lot of work to convince these gentlemen and women that are doing similar statements, Ita Sargal in Amnesty and others, that the organizations that they have, for good moral reasons, put so much faith in, have betrayed the cause. And finally, the second to last point is to go after the money. The money needs to be transparent, it needs to be discussed, and it needs to be analyzed and questioned. The Ford Foundation, which was the primary funder of the Durban Conference that I opened this presentation with, has largely cut off most of its funding. Some of it's still going through, but most of the organizations have been cut off because they were not promoting the objectives for which the funding was provided. The Canadian government now has cut off something like $15 million that had gone to abusive frameworks that claimed but did not actually promote human rights and did much of their work without transparency. Ireland, some European governments have also taken similar steps, perhaps because of funding difficulties, perhaps out of moral positions and reassessment. And the Knesset transparency legislation, which has been denounced as McCarthyism and anti-democratic. If anybody can explain to me why having organizations that receive funding from foreign governments transparently every 3 months provide information on their funding is somehow anti-democratic or McCarthyist, I will be very grateful, because I have not found any reason other than the fact that these organizations and their funders that claim to promote democratic principles in fact do the opposite. This is a slow but steady process. We managed to find the information that the funding for the electronic intifada was coming from the Dutch government through a church-based outsourcing organization, humanitarian aid organization called ICO. The Dutch foreign minister had no idea that his government was funding the BDS and Israel apartheid week activities around the world. It was hidden in the budget. And if we can duplicate this by 20 or 30 different examples, it will have a profound impact, I think, on their ability to wage this kind of war. Finally, I think most importantly, it is to form alliances with real victims of human rights abuses. Human rights is an important value. When human rights are violated, and yes, human rights appear to have been violated by Israeli soldiers in the video that unfortunately we all saw in the last 24 hours, whatever the provocation, whatever the framework, and we need to know the context and we need to know the details, but certainly based on the video, there was excessive use of force. I'm not a judge. I'm not going to make the legal analysis. We don't have enough information. But when there are clear abuses of human rights, not fabricated, not exploited for political purposes, then those need to be dealt with according to the proper mechanisms. By ending the abuse and the exploitation of human rights as a cynical political weapon to further the campaign to wipe Israel off the map, to make Israel, to turn Israel into somehow the new apartheid state, and therefore end the right of the Jewish people to national self-determination, and that's the goal. That process is also destroying the universal foundations and moral principles of human rights. And that's just as much a tragedy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Your last comment reminds me of the Midrash, which says that